The warning came on a Tuesday. Not in words. Not in any sound a wolf could make with its mouth. It came in the way Sable went still when the alpha, Voss, entered the den that morning. The way his shoulders pulled inward. The way every other wolf in the pack looked anywhere except at Sable. That particular kind of silence. The kind a pack produces right before it does something it will pretend to forget. Sable was the omega of the Asheville pack. He was not weak. That is the first thing you need to understand. He was not slow. He was not stupid. He had survived 11 winters in a pack that treated him like furniture, and surviving that kind of thing takes a specific type of intelligence that has no name in polite company. He knew where every wolf stood before they knew where they were going. He knew when trouble was moving through the territory 2 days before anyone else smelled it. He knew things. And knowing things, in the Asheville pack, was not a gift. It was a target. Kieran was 23 years old and built like the word consequence. He was one of 3 young males in the pack who carried alpha blood, not the title, not yet, but the weight of it. Everyone knew where he was headed. He moved through the territory like he owned a third of it already, because someday he would. He trained every morning until his muscles refused, and then he trained some more. He was not cruel. That distinction matters. He was simply comfortable in a world that had been arranged to favor him, and comfort at that level stops a person from asking certain questions. Dex was a year younger than Kieran, quieter, faster. Where Kieran entered a room like an announcement, Dex entered like a question mark. He read situations the way a fisherman reads water, not with drama, but with patience and precision. He was the one the others asked when they needed to think something through. He was also the one who noticed things he chose not to say out loud. He had been choosing that for a long time. Ron was the youngest of the 3 at 21. He laughed easily, moved carelessly, and had the kind of face that made people trust him before he had done anything to earn it. He was not shallow. He just wore his surface on the outside, which is different. Underneath, he carried a quiet that the other 2 did not know was there. He had gotten good at keeping it there. The 3 of them had grown up knowing Sable the way you know the weather. He was always present. He was always useful. He was never thanked. He covered for Kieran twice in the Wolf Council when Kieran was late without reason. He once spent 3 days tracking a missing juvenile through the eastern marshes, found her, brought her back, and Voss announced the recovery as a pack success without speaking Sable's name once. Dex saw that. He filed it somewhere and did not speak. Ron was 16 at the time and thought, briefly, that it was not right, and then went back to being 16 and stopped thinking about it. Sable found the evidence on a cold Thursday in the 3rd month of the year. He was not looking for it. He had been sent to the western edge of Asheville territory to document a boundary dispute, tedious work, the kind assigned to Omegas because it required careful attention and no one wanted to admit that careful attention had value. He was cataloging marker sites, cross-referencing movement patterns, and he found the record. Hidden, but not hidden well enough. Voss had been in contact with the Ridgeborne Coalition for 40 months. Not as an enemy. As a source. He had been feeding them information, territory maps, patrol schedules, weaknesses in the pack's northern coverage, the names of wolves who might be persuaded to shift their loyalty if the price was right. The Ridgeborne Coalition was not a pack. It was a machine. It absorbed smaller groups the way a river absorbs tributaries, quietly, inexorably, until the tributary had a new name and could no longer remember where it started. 3 packs in the past 6 years had gone in and not come out as themselves. Sable sat with the evidence for 1 full day. He organized it. He made it undeniable. He rehearsed what he was going to say and how he was going to say it, because he knew that the way an Omega delivered truth mattered as much as the truth itself. He stood before the pack council on a Friday evening and he laid it out with the calm of someone who had nothing to lose because the pack had already taken everything he had. Voss did not deny it. He sat very still for a long moment, and then he looked at Sable with the particular expression of a man deciding which version of events to inhabit. He chose the one where Sable was the problem. The exile happened within the hour. Voss called it contamination. He said Sebo had been feeding false reports to the Eastern Scouts. He said Sebo had been building alliances outside the pack without sanction. Every word was a mirror image of the truth, and the pack accepted it the way packs accept most things, because the alternative was to look at Voss and ask when he had started lying, and that question had a weight no one wanted to lift. Karen stood at the edge of the circle and did not speak. Dex stood beside him and did not speak. Ron stood one step back from both of them and felt something move through his chest that he did not have a name for yet. He would find the name later. That night, alone, staring at the ceiling of the den with the sound of Sebo's departure still somewhere in the air around him, Ron would find the word. The word was shame. Sebo walked out of Asheville territory at dusk. He carried what he could. He did not look back. He had spent 11 years with people who looked through him, and he had learned that looking back at them was a waste of ice. The pack watched him go. Some of them were relieved. Most of them were simply moving on to the next thing, the way people do when the uncomfortable thing has been removed and they can breathe again. Voss stood at the front of the group with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had just handled a problem efficiently. 3 days passed. On the third morning, Karen's sleeping place was empty. No note. No confrontation. No ceremony. Just an absence where a person had been. Dex found it first. He stood at the edge of the empty space for a long moment, reading it. Then he went to his own corner of the den, picked up his pack, and started moving. He did not leave a note either. He was done with notes. Ron was already outside when Dex emerged. He was sitting on a rock at the edge of the territory line with his pack beside him. He looked up when Dex appeared. Dex looked at him. Neither of them said anything about Karen. Neither of them said anything about Voss. They just started walking in the direction the tracks went, because the tracks went east, into the outer reach, and east was the only direction that still felt honest. The outer reach was not dead land. That was the pack story about it, and the pack had told that story for long enough that most of them believed it. The truth was that the outer reach was simply land the pack did not understand, which is a different thing entirely. It was cold in the mornings and warmer by midday than the canopy suggested. The ground was uneven but navigable once you stopped expecting it to be familiar. There were streams. There were rabbits. There was a low ridge that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything look briefly, unreasonably hopeful. Sebo was moving fast through it. Not like a person fleeing. Like a person with somewhere to be. They found Karen first, 2 hours into the outer reach, sitting beside a stream and eating from a cold supply in his pack. He looked up when the other 2 arrived. He looked between them. He said nothing. The 3 of them sat together for a minute in a silence that had more texture than most conversations, and then they all stood up and kept moving. They found Sebo at a river crossing at dusk on the second day. He was crossing in efficient, precise steps, moving in the way of someone who had learned the bottom of this particular river and knew which rocks held. He heard them coming before they reached the bank. He stopped in the middle of the water and turned and looked at the 3 of them standing on the shore, and his expression was the one he always had, the one the pack had always read as blankness. It was not blankness. It was the careful arrangement of a face that had learned not to give things away for free. Karen said they had come to help. Sebo said, from the middle of the river, that they had come because they felt guilty, and that those were not the same thing. Nobody argued with him. Because nobody could. He crossed the rest of the river and stood on the far bank and looked at them across the water, and after a moment he said to come across. His voice was level. It carried no warmth and no hostility. It was simply a set of words that pointed toward an action. They crossed. The water was cold. The other bank was solid under their feet. Sebo was already moving by the time Ron climbed out, and the 3 of them followed him into the outer reach because it was the only direction left that made any sense. Nobody said thank you. Nobody said sorry. Those words were too small for the shape of the moment and all 4 of them knew it. The outer reach opened ahead of them, wide and cold and entirely indifferent to what anyone had done or failed to do. Sebo knew where he was going. The three alphas knew only that they were following. For the first time in their lives, that was enough. 3 days into the outer reach and Kieran still had not fully admitted, even to himself, that he was afraid. Not of the terrain. Not of exposure or cold or the occasional sound that moved through the dark beyond the tree line at night. He was afraid of the specific way Sebo moved. It was the movement of a person who had already done the math and reached conclusions, and those conclusions had been reached without consulting anyone from the Asheville Park, and that meant the park, all of its rankings and its structures and everything Kieran had been trained to believe about how the world was organized, had not been necessary for a single second of Sebo's planning. That was a particular kind of terrifying. Kieran kept it behind his ribs and did not let it onto his face. Sebo woke before any of them. He moved without the stiffness that comes from sleeping on hard ground because he had spent years sleeping on the edge of a den where the floor was harder and the drafts came from 2 directions. His body had adapted. The 3 alphas woke so each morning and stretched in silence and pretended they were fine. Sebo had already started the fire and assessed the next leg of the route and eaten before any of them had finished being fully awake. He did not speak much. When he did, the words were specific and functional. Turn left at the split birch. The water from that stream is good. Stay on the high line past midday, the low ground floods by afternoon. He did not explain how he knew these things. He had been out here before, clearly, and more than once. Dex filed this information carefully without comment. On the 4th day, the trees changed. The canopy thinned and then opened into a wide, sloping meadow cut through by a cold, clear stream, and on the far side of the stream there were wolves. Not a pack. Not organized in any structure that read as familiar. There were 9 of them in the first group Kieran could see, and as Sebo led them down the slope and across the water, more emerged from the tree line on the east side. 14. Then 22. Then more. They were of different sizes and different colorings and different ages, and the only thing they had in common was the way they watched Sebo come back. Relief. That was the thing on their faces. Not the relief of soldiers watching a general return. Simpler than that. The relief of people who had not been sure whether someone they depended on was going to come back, and now he had, and now they could breathe again. Sebo moved through them without ceremony. He asked specific questions of specific wolves. He listened to the answers, made adjustments to something in his head, and kept moving. He introduced the 3 alphas with the economy of a man who did not have time for social performance. He said their names. He said they were useful. That was it. A woman named Claire, sharp-eyed and somewhere in her early 40s, looked at the 3 of them with the expression of someone inspecting tools to see if they would hold. She was not hostile. She was practical. There is a difference. She said to Kieran, "You smell like rank." He said he knew. She said rank does not mean anything here. He said he was beginning to understand that. She studied him for another moment, decided something, and moved on. The network, because that was what it was, had been built on a principle Sebo had developed over the course of 14 months of working alone in the outer reach. The principle was simple: the wolves the packs threw away were the wolves who survived throwing. They knew things that comfortable wolves did not know. They had learned to be resourceful in the way that only genuine difficulty teaches. They had contacts, routes, patterns of movement across territory that no pack council had ever mapped because pack councils did not believe unmapped territory was worth knowing. There were wolves from 3 broken packs in the network. There were loners who had never belonged to any pack and had no intention of starting now, but who had found in Sebo's framework something worth contributing to. There was a young male named Perry who was 17 and had the look of someone who had been hard used by the world and had decided the world was going to have to deal with the version of him that came out the other side. Ron found Perry at the edge of the camp on the second night, sitting alone with a cup of cold water and looking at the dark tree line. Ron sat down beside him without being invited. Perry looked at him sideways. Ron said nothing. Perry said, "You are one of the 3 who followed the Omega." Ron said yes. Perry said, "Why?" Ron thought about it for a genuine moment, which was more than most people gave the question, and then said, "Because the alternative was staying." Perry looked back at the tree line. He said, "That is the most honest thing I have heard an alpha say." Ron sat with that for a while. The network operated through information, not force. This was the part that Kieran kept turning over in his mind because it did not fit anything he had been trained for. Pack strength was measured in physical dominance, in territory held by presence and patrol, in the clear signal of who was strongest and therefore who led. Sabo's structure did not work that way. It worked through what people knew, and who they knew, and where they could move without being seen. It worked through the fact that nobody in any of the surrounding packs or the Ridgeborn coalition was paying attention to the Exiles and the Loners and the Omega. That invisibility was the infrastructure. Dex saw it clearly on day 2 and sat with the geometric beauty of it privately, turning it over like a stone with an interesting weight. Then Sabo called them all together, and he showed them the map. It was hand-drawn on 3 pieces of joined material, detailed and marked in a code that Sabo explained without rushing. The Ridgeborn coalition's territory was expanding in a shape that looked, from above, like a hand closing. 14 months of Voss feeding them information had given the coalition everything they needed to make the absorption look voluntary. The Asheville Pack believed they were entering an alliance. They were entering a structure that would take their territory, redistribute their wolves, and dissolve their identity so slowly that by the time they felt it, the name Asheville would belong to a historical footnote. The silence after Sabo finished speaking had texture. Kieran stood very still. Dexter's jaw tightened in a single, controlled movement. Ron looked at the map and thought about the juvenile wolves back home. The young ones who were growing up inside a story that was a lie. Kieran said they needed to go back. Warn the pack. Dex said the pack would not believe it. He said it without cruelty. Just accurately. Ron looked at Sabo. He asked how long Sabo had known. Sabo said, long enough that by the time he had the proof, going back to the pack was already the wrong move. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the meadow with the slow, indifferent patience of something that did not care what any of them decided. Then Kieran said, "So what is the right move?" And Sabo, for the first time, looked at him without the careful blankness. He looked at him directly, the way a person looks at someone they have decided, provisionally and subject to revision, might be worth the truth. He said, "We bring them out. Not all of them. Some of them are already too far in. But enough. We move before the coalition finalizes the absorption. We use the routes my network knows. We pull out everyone who can still be pulled." He laid out the timeline. It was specific. It had been planned. He had already been planning this before they followed him into the outer reach. He had been planning it before Voss called him contaminated. He had been planning it from the moment he found the evidence and understood that the pack was not going to save itself. Kieran looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at Sabo and said, "You knew we would come after you." Sabo said, "I thought it was possible." Kieran said, "And if we had not?" Sabo said, "Then there would have been fewer hands. The plan would have taken longer. But it would have proceeded." There was something in the simplicity of that answer that rearranged something fundamental in how Kieran understood the shape of the world. He did not have words for it yet. He stood at the edge of what he had been and looked at the space where his certainty used to be, and he did not feel empty. He felt, unexpectedly, like something was about to begin. Claire moved up beside Sabo and began going over the first phase logistics, and the network gathered around the map, and the planning started for real, and the 3 alphas from Asheville moved in among the others and found their places, and not one of those places was at the front. That was new. That was going to take some getting used to. Ron caught Perry's eye across the fire. Perry gave him a small, dry nod. Ron almost smiled. Almost. The operation had a name. Sabo had not given it one. Claire had not given it one. Perry, who turned out to be quietly funny when no one was making demands of him, had suggested calling it the long way home, but said it with enough irony that nobody could tell if he was serious, and so the name did not stick. The operation had no name. It was simply what they were going to do, and the lack of ceremony around it felt right. Sebo divided the extraction into phases. Not because he enjoyed the architecture of plans, but because the alternative was chaos, and chaos produced the kind of unpredictable outcomes that the coalition would be able to exploit. Phase 1 was observation. Phase 2 was contact. Phase 3 was movement. Each phase had to complete cleanly before the next one started. The network understood this because most of them had arrived in the outer reach because someone else's plan had not been clean, and they had paid the price of that. Claire took the observation. She had spent 20 years in and around Asheville territory before her own exile, and she knew the territory's rhythms the way a musician knows a piece they have played 10,000 times. She knew which patrols ran long. She knew which wolves took the same route every time because they were tired or lazy or both. She knew the 3-hour window in the late afternoon when the northern perimeter thinned because the wolf assigned to it had a young daughter who was sick and kept finding reasons to be elsewhere. She went in alone and came back with information that Sebo spent 2 hours organizing into a revised map. The coalition's envoys had arrived at Asheville Central then. Not soldiers. Administrators. People carrying documents and speaking in careful, measured language about partnership and shared benefit and the strength of unified structure. Voss had received them with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this day and was trying very hard not to show that he had been waiting. The pack was confused. That was the word Claire used. Not panicked. Not resistant. Confused in the specific way of people who trust the person who is supposed to interpret events for them, and that person is interpreting events in a language that does not quite match what their eyes are seeing. Voss was presenting the coalition's arrival as a triumph. The pack was trying to figure out how to feel triumphant about something that felt, for reasons they could not articulate, like the ground shifting. Kieran listened to Claire's report and felt something cold move through him. He had grown up in that pack. He knew how those wolves thought. He knew exactly how the confusion would progress. It would progress into compliance. Not because they were weak, but because they had been trained, all of their lives, to trust the hierarchy. Voss was the hierarchy. Voss said this was good. And so, one by one, in the private spaces of their own minds, they would find ways to make it seem good, because the alternative was to believe that the structure they had ordered their entire lives around had produced a leader who was selling them. That is not a belief most people can hold and stay standing. Ron was in charge of phase 2. Contact. This was the part that required the specific quality he had, which was the ability to make people feel safe with him before they had any rational reason to be. He went in with Perry and a quiet woman named Ida who had grown up on the southern border of Asheville territory and still had cousins inside. They moved at night, using routes that Claire had mapped and Sebo had verified. They did not go to the central den. They went to the edges. To the wolves who slept at the periphery. The first wolf Ron contacted was a young male named Cole who had been 2 years behind him in training. Cole opened his eyes in the dark and saw Ron and went very still. Ron put a hand on his arm and said his name quietly, and something in Cole's posture changed from readiness to listening, because Cole had always been able to tell when Ron was serious, and Ron had never looked more serious. Ron told him the truth. All of it. The evidence Sebo had found. The 14 months of Voss feeding the coalition. The dissolution that was already in motion. He said it without dramatics because the facts were dramatic enough on their own and anything extra would have made it sound like a story rather than a report. Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where is Sebo?" Ron said, "Outer reach. He has been building something. He has space for more people if they want to come." Cole said, "Voss said Sebo was lying." Ron said, "Voss would." Another long quiet. Cole's jaw worked slightly, the way jaws do when a person is chewing on something that does not go down easy. Then he said, "How many people know this?" Ron said, "Not enough. Yet." Cole lay back in the dark and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he sat up and started moving quietly, and Ron moved with him, and that was phase 2 beginning. Over 4 nights, Ron and Perry and Ida made contact with 31 wolves. Not all 31 agreed to come. Some of them did not believe it. Some of them believed it and were afraid. Some of them believed it and chose, privately and without sharing the reason to stay. Those were the hardest. Ron did not try to force anyone. Sebo had been clear about this. You cannot extract someone who has decided not to be extracted. You can only open a door. What they do with the open door is their own. 17 wolves agreed to move. Dex coordinated the routes. He had spent the observation period studying the map until he had it behind his eyes, and now he ran the logistics with the kind of quiet precision that had always been his. He set staggered timings. He identified 3 separate extraction paths based on patrol patterns and weather and the location of each departing wolf within the territory. He built in contingencies. He was, Sebo told him once during those days, very good at this. Dex looked at him and said, I have always been good at this. Nobody asked me to do it before. Sebo said, I know. And that was the whole conversation, but it held more than most conversations 3 times its length. Karen's job was harder to define, and he had the most trouble with it. His job was to be ready. To stand at the receiving end of each extraction path and make sure that when the departing wolves crossed into the outer reach, there was a calm face waiting for them, a familiar face, a face that said, this side is real and it holds. He was not leading. He was not strategizing. He was present. He was an anchor. He was 48 hours into that role before he understood it was the most important one in the operation. The first group crossed on the 3rd night. 7 wolves, moving in single file through the east path Dex had mapped. They emerged from the tree line into the meadow where Sebo's network had set up the first reception point, and they stopped and looked around at the gathered faces, and Claire stepped forward and said, welcome to the other side of that decision. Someone brought them water. Someone brought them food. Nobody made a speech. There was no ceremony. Kieran stood at the edge and watched them take in the reality of where they were, and he thought about the last time he had been at the center of things, and how far away that felt, and how it did not feel like loss. The second group crossed on the 4th night. 5 wolves, including Cole, who moved with the tight economy of a person who had made up their mind and was not looking back. Cole came through the tree line, saw Kieran, and stopped. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, you actually came out here for him. Kieran said, yes. Cole said, I did not think you would. Kieran said, neither did I, honestly. Cole made a sound that was almost a laugh. He walked past and into the reception point, and Ida found him something warm to drink, and Perry sat down next to him and did not ask him how he felt about it, which was, Perry had learned, often more comforting than any question. The third group crossed on the 5th night, and something went wrong. The patrol that was supposed to be occupied with the sick child's father was not occupied. He had been reassigned. The new patrol came through 40 minutes earlier than the map schedule, and Ida was in the wrong place at the wrong moment and had to move fast in the wrong direction and spent 3 hours in the cold before she could look back to the extraction path. The 5 wolves in her group had to hold position in the dark for those 3 hours without sound, without movement, without knowing if the plan was still intact or if everything had come apart. It was Ron who found them. He had tracked backward along the path when the timing slipped, walking by instinct and the knowledge of the ground that weeks in the outer reach had given him. He moved through the dark until he found them huddled in the fold of a hillside, and he crouched down and said, still good. 30 more minutes and we move. Nobody said anything. But the quality of the silence changed. They crossed 35 minutes later. All 5 of them, and Ida behind them, emerging into the meadow with the controlled relief of people who had held it together through something that required holding it together, and were now, finally, allowed to let it go. The meadow received them. The network received them. The outer reach was cold and uneven and did not particularly care about any of them, and that was fine. That was exactly fine. Sebo counted heads. He revised the map. He updated the timeline. He was already working on Phase 4 in his head, which did not officially exist yet but which he had known was coming since the beginning, because the coalition would not finalize the absorption without one more move, and that move would require a response, and he had been designing that response since before anyone knew there was going to be a question. He walked by firelight long after the others had settled. Kieran found him there at what must have been 2 in the morning, bent over the map with the concentration of someone building something that has to hold. Kieran sat down on the other side of the fire. He did not say anything. Sebo did not look up. They sat like that for a while, the fire between them, the outer reach silent around them, the meadow holding the sleeping weight of people who had left one word and not yet found the name for the new one. Kieran said, "What happens when Voss realizes wolves are leaving?" Sebo said, "He already knows." Kieran said, "And?" Sebo said, "And he will try to use it. He will tell the coalition that his own people are being radicalized by the Omega he exiled. It will make them move faster on the absorption. Which is what we need." Kieran looked at him across the fire. He said, "You want them to move faster?" Sebo said, "I need them to show their hand before they are ready to show it cleanly. A forced acceleration produces mistakes. Mistakes produce visibility. Visibility is what the other packs in this region need to see before they decide whether the coalition is something they want to join or something they need to resist." He said it the way someone says something they have known for a long time and waited a long time to say out loud. Kieran sat with that. He sat with the scale of it. 11 wolves out of Ashvale was not the plan. 11 wolves was the first step of a plan that was aimed at something much larger, and Sebo had been aiming at it alone for more than a year. He said, "You should have had help from the beginning." Sebo looked up from the map for the first time. He looked at Kieran with the particular expression of a person who has been told something accurate and does not quite know what to do with the accuracy of it. He said, "Yes. I should have." He went back to the map. Kieran stayed by the fire. Neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to, and the fire burned down slowly and the outer reach breathed around them in the dark. The coalition moved on a Wednesday. Not with soldiers. Not with any show of force. That was the thing about the coalition that made it so hard to stop by ordinary means. It moved with paper. With authorized documents and formal language and the kind of carefully structured agreement that looks, on the surface, like two parties choosing each other freely. Voss signed the absorption agreement in the central den with 3 coalition administrators present, and the ceremony was brief and understated, and by the time it was done the Ashvale Park, as a legal and territorial entity, had ceased to exist. The wolves inside did not feel the moment it happened. That was the design. The design was that the change would arrive gradually, in the form of new instructions, new assignments, new faces in administrative roles, new expectations about patrol routes and reporting structures. The wolves would adapt, as people adapt, because the alternative was conflict with an entity much larger than themselves, and most wolves, like most people, will bend before they break if bending is presented as cooperation. Sebo knew the Wednesday it happened because one of Claire's contacts inside Ashvale territory sent a message through the network's relay system. The message was brief. 4 words. "It is done here." Sebo read it and set it down and sat with it for exactly 3 minutes by his own internal count, which was the amount of time he had decided, in advance, that he would allow for the weight of the moment. 3 minutes for the thing he had worked to prevent and had not, in this final form, been able to prevent. Then he stood up and called the network together because there was still work to do and he was not going to waste the work by spending more than 3 minutes on what could not be changed. The network gathered in the meadow. 38 wolves now, counting the Ashvale arrivals and the existing members and 3 new loners who had found their way in over the past weeks. Sebo stood at the center without standing on anything to be seen over the crowd, because he was tall enough and because he did not do theater. He told them what had happened. He told them what it meant. He told them what was going to happen next. The absorption, he said, would produce a specific kind of pressure in the surrounding parks. The coalition had expanded its territory by absorbing Ashvale. It now shared a border with the Crestline Park to the north and the Hollow Ridge Group to the west. Both of those parks had been watching the coalition with the careful, lateral attention of animals who sense something moving in their peripheral vision. The absorption of Ashvale would make that movement impossible to ignore. The network's job was to be visible now. Not to the coalition. To Crestline. To Hollow Ridge. To every group in the region that had been deciding, for months, whether to move toward the coalition or away from it. Sebo had already been in contact with individuals in both groups through the network's relay system. He had been sending them information. Not arguments. Not appeals. Information. The maps. The timeline. The documented history of what Voss had sold and when and to whom. He had been building a picture and distributing pieces of it, carefully, to people who would know what to do with the picture. Kieran listened to all of this and felt the same rearrangement that had been happening in him since the river crossing. He was watching a plan that had been running in parallel to everything he understood as planning, a plan that did not look like dominance and did not require a throne and was going to do more than anything he had ever been trained to accomplish. He raised his hand. Sebo looked at him. Kieran asked what he needed. Sebo said, Cole knows 3 wolves in the Crestline leadership. I need you and Cole to go north. Not to talk. To listen. To let them ask questions and to answer those questions with the same information I have been sending. Your face from the Ashvale Park will carry weight. Use it. Kieran said, I thought rank did not mean anything here. Sebo said, it does not mean anything here. It means something to them. That is different. Kieran left with Cole the next morning. Ron stayed. His job shifted in those days to the inside of the network, which was expanding faster than it had been designed to expand and needed the specific thing Ron was good at, which was the human maintenance of people under pressure. There were arguments. There were moments when the weight of displacement and uncertainty converted itself into anger pointed at whoever was nearby. Ron moved through those moments with a patience that surprised even him, settling things not by authority but by presence. Perry watched him do it one afternoon when a disagreement between 2 of the older wolves was heading towards something loud and unproductive. Ron walked into the middle of it, said 3 sentences, and the temperature dropped. Perry said, Where did you learn to do that? Ron said, I did not. I just did it. Perry said, That is how you know it is real. Ron sat with that for a while. He was sitting with a lot of things these days. The outer reach gave you time for that, if you were paying attention. Dex went south. Sebo sent him to the Hollow Ridge group with Ida as his partner, carrying the second half of the documented evidence and specific instructions about who in the Hollow Ridge structure would be most capable of receiving it and understanding its implications. He and Ida were gone for 5 days. They came back with something quiet in both of them, the kind of quiet that comes from conversations that matter, and Dex reported to Sebo for 2 hours while Ida slept and the network waited. The Hollow Ridge leadership was not ready to act. They were ready to listen. In Sebo's framework, those were different points on the same line, and the distance between them was shorter than most people thought. The coalition moved again on the second Thursday. Not documents this time. Patrols. Coalition patrols entered what had been Ashvale territory and began re-establishing the boundary markers according to the coalition's maps, which were different from Ashvale's maps in the specific ways that favor the entity with the larger army. 2 wolves who had stayed behind in Ashvale tried to protest the repositioning of a boundary marker on the eastern edge. They were not hurt. They were informed, in careful administrative language, that the eastern boundary had been renegotiated as part of the absorption agreement and that any concerns about the repositioning should be directed to the appropriate coalition intake office. The appropriate coalition intake office did not exist yet. It would be established, eventually, in 6 to 8 weeks. Word of the boundary repositioning moved through the network in 4 hours. Sebo added it to the picture he was building and sending north to Crestline and west to Hollow Ridge. Not as alarm. As data. He was not trying to frighten anyone into action. He was making sure that when action became necessary, the people who needed to act would have already seen it coming. Kieran came back from the north on the 8th day. He came back with Cole and also with a wolf named Evan who was one of the 3 Crestline leadership figures Cole had mentioned. Evan was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of calm that comes from spending decades making decisions that affected many people. He had asked to come and see the network for himself before he made any commitments on behalf of Crestline. He spent 2 days in the outer reach asking questions and receiving answers. He walked the meadow and the ridge and the network supply routes. He talked to Claire and to Ida and to Perry. He sat with the map for a long hour and said nothing and then said, "How long have you been building this?" Sebo told him. 14 months of planning. 4 months of active network construction. The last 3 weeks of extraction and contact. Evan said, "You did this while you were Omega of a pack that was using you for labor." Sebo said, "Yes." Evan said, "What do you need from Crestline?" And Sebo told him. Not an army. Not a declaration. A coordinated refusal. A formal communication from Crestline and Hollow Ridge, sent simultaneously to the coalition's regional authority, noting the documented evidence of the coalition's methods and declining any invitation toward absorption or alliance. Not a fight. A line. A line drawn by more than one hand, which is the kind of line that is much harder to cross than the kind drawn by one. Evan left on the morning of the third day. He said he would bring the proposal to the Crestline Council. He said he thought they would say yes. He said it with the specific tone of a person who knows the council and has already been turning the question over in their mind. That was enough. There was a juvenile wolf in the network named Petra, 16 years old, who had come from the third group out of Asheville and who had, in the weeks since, become something of a shadow to Sebo. Not following him for instruction. Watching him the way someone watches something they are trying to understand. One evening she asked him directly, "Do you think this is going to work?" Sebo looked at her. He said, "Most of it will work. Some of it will not. What we are building is not a victory. It is a structure. Structures take longer than victories, but they last." Petra said, "What do you do when the part that does not work is the part you needed most?" Sebo said, "You find another path to the same place. There is always another path." She sat with that. He went back to what he was doing. The fire was low. The outer reach was dark around them and the meadow held its sleeping weight and the plan moved forward in the way that good plans move, not loudly, not with announcement, but steadily, like water finding the lowest point. The word came from inside Asheville territory on a gray morning with low cloud and the smell of rain moving in from the west. A juvenile named Owen crossed into the outer reach alone. He was 16 and had made the crossing at night without help and without telling anyone he was going, which meant he had been afraid of what would happen if he told someone. He came through the tree line in the early morning with the specific look of a person who has done something frightening and is now standing on the other side of it, shaking slightly but still standing. Ron found him at the edge of the meadow. He brought him water and sat down beside him and waited. Owen drank. Then he said, "Voss told everyone that the three of you were traitors. That you went with Sebo because Sebo manipulated you. They burned your sleeping places in the den." It was presented as a formal removal. Ron said nothing. He watched Owen's face and said nothing. Owen said, he told the pack that Sebo had been working against Asheville for years. That the evidence he presented was fabricated to cover his own loyalty to the coalition. Ron said, and people believed that. Owen said, some of them. Some of them did not know what to believe. Some of them just went quiet. Ron said, how many went quiet? Owen said, most of them. Ron sat with that. He knew what most of them going quiet meant. It meant the seeds were there. It meant the doubt was moving. It meant that Sebo's documented evidence, distributed quietly through the network's relay system into the hands of specific wolves within Asheville, was sitting in people's minds and doing the slow, patient work of truth in a place where truth had been suppressed. He brought Owen to Sebo. Sebo listened to the full account, asked 6 clarifying questions, and added the information to the map in his head. Then he looked at Owen and said, you came through alone. Ron said, yes. Sebo said to Owen, that was very well done. Owen looked like someone who had not been told that kind of thing recently. He looked like someone who was not entirely sure what to do with it. He looked, briefly, like a 16-year-old. Then he straightened and said, what can I do here? Sebo said, rest first. Then we will find out. Karen heard about the burned sleeping places from Ron that evening. He sat with it quietly. He did not feel what he expected to feel. He did not feel rage or humiliation. He felt something more like confirmation. A door closing on a version of himself that had already been living for weeks. He found Dex later and told him. Dex said, "It was always going to be that." Karen said, "I know." They stood on the ridge at dusk, looking west, the outer ridge falling away below them in long shadowed slopes, and Karen said, "I don't miss it. Not the den. Not the rank." Dex said, "What do you miss?" Karen thought about it honestly. He said, "The knowing what I was for." Dex said, "You know what you are for now. You just don't get a title with it." Karen turned that over. He said, "Is that supposed to be comforting?" Dex said, "It is supposed to be accurate." There was a long quiet. Then Karen said, "Close enough." The coalition's response to Crestline and Hollow Ridge's coordinated refusal arrived on a Friday, 4 days after Evan had taken the proposal back to the council and 2 days after the simultaneous formal communications had been sent. The response was polished and cool and spoke at length about the coalition's deep respect for all regional groups and their commitment to voluntary engagement and the many benefits of unified structure. It did not, in any direct language, threaten anything. It also did not, in any direct language, address a single point from the evidence documents that Crestline and Hollow Ridge had included with their refusal. Sebo read the response and said, "Good." Claire said, "That is a dismissal." Sebo said, "That is a mistake." They did not address the evidence because addressing it would mean acknowledging it exists. Now every pack in the region who sees the exchange will notice that the coalition refused to respond to documented evidence. The silence is the answer. He was already drafting the note that would carry this observation to 6 additional regional groups who had been watching the Crestline and Hollow Ridge refusals with the careful attention of people who had not yet decided what they thought. Voss's position inside the absorbed Asheville structure deteriorated over those same days with a speed that surprised even him. The coalition had no use for a leader whose pack had been dissolved. He was reassigned. Not removed, not disciplined, reassigned to an administrative coordination role that had no authority and no meaningful function. The title was long. The power was gone. He was not told this directly. He discovered it through a series of small reductions. The meetings he was no longer invited to. The decisions made without his input. The new face in his former office. He discovered it the way people discover erosion, not in a moment but in a series of mornings where the ground is slightly lower than the day before. A wolf named Marcus, who had been one of the most loyal Asheville members and had chosen to stay through the absorption, sent a message through the network's relay system on the 3rd week. The message was longer than most. He described what was happening inside the coalition's new Asheville division. He described the confusion and the slow anger building among the remaining wolves. He described Voss's reduction. He asked, without asking directly, whether there was still room in the outer reach. Sebo sent back, "Yes." And the path. 7 more wolves came out over the following week. Not in organized groups this time. In ones and twos, in the middle of the night, using the path coordinates from Sebo's message. They arrived in the meadow in the early hours, disoriented and cold, and the network received them without ceremony and without the need for ceremony. Marcus came last. He was one of the oldest wolves from the original Asheville pack, and he had the dignity of old age, which is not the dignity of youth but something weightier and quieter. He crossed the tree line in the grey light just before dawn and walked into the meadow and stopped and looked around at everything that had been built here, in the cold land the pack had called dead, and his expression was the complex one of someone confronting what they were wrong about and finding it larger than expected. Ron brought him water. Marcus drank. He said, "The pack does not exist anymore." Ron said, "This is what exists now." Marcus looked at the meadow, the network's camp, the faces of people from 3 different broken structures living and working beside each other without ranks on their backs. He said, "What do you call it?" Ron said, "We have not decided yet." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe that is the right answer." Owen, who had been helping with the camp supply organization, came over and showed Marcus where to sleep. He did it with the confidence of someone who has been here long enough to know, which was 3 weeks. Marcus followed him, and the meadow held them both. Voss arrived at the outer reach on a morning when the rain was coming sideways. He had not been invited. He had not announced himself. He came through the eastern tree line alone, without a pack behind him, without the posture he had carried for 20 years. He was diminished, and the diminishment was visible in every line of him, in the way his shoulders had moved inward, in the way his eyes had the restless tracking quality of a person who has lost the territory they used to own by presence alone. He found Karen first. Karen was on the ridge checking the eastern approaches as part of the morning watch, which was something he did now without being asked, because the morning watch needed doing and he was available. He turned and saw Voss standing 10 meters below him on the slope, and for a moment neither of them moved. Voss said things. He said them with the vocabulary of justification, which is a specific language that sounds like explanation but is actually defense, and the two things feel similar from the inside and look very different from the outside. He said, the coalition would have come regardless. He said, the absorption was inevitable. He said, he had been protecting the pack by managing the terms of the absorption instead of resisting it blindly. He said, what he had done was strategy, and strategy required a kind of vision that not everyone was positioned to understand. Karen stood on the ridge in the sideways rain and listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. When Voss was done, Karen was quiet for a moment, and then he stepped aside on the path and gestured down the slope toward the meadow. He said, if you want to come in, come in. If you want to stay out here and talk, I will be on this ridge for another hour. Voss looked at him. He looked at the step aside, the open path, the complete absence of any confrontation, and something in his face shifted into an expression Karen did not recognize at first and then recognized as a man who has built his identity entirely on the responses of others and is now confronting a response he does not know what to do with. Voss walked down the slope. He walked into the meadow. He sat at the far edge of the camp and nobody came to welcome him and nobody came to confront him, and that absence was its own complete statement. Sebo was at the map table in the center of the camp and he saw Voss walk in and he noted it and went back to what he was doing. Claire saw Sebo not react and took her cue from that. Perry saw Claire not react and added it to what he was learning about how this place worked. The camp went on going on, in the ordinary, functional way of things that have purpose and do not need drama to sustain them. Voss sat at the edge for most of that day. Toward evening, Owen brought him something to eat, because Owen was 16 and had not learned yet that feeding someone complicated required more thought than feeding someone hungry, and Sebo, watching from across the camp, decided not to correct it. The boy's instinct was toward basic decency, and that was not an instinct to discourage. The second month in the outer reach was different from the first in a way that was hard to name but easy to feel. The first month had been emergency. Everything had the quality of speed and necessity and the specific focus that comes from having no choice but the immediate next step. The second month had a different texture. The emergency had not passed. The coalition was still there. The absorption of Asheville was still real. The work was still ongoing. But something had shifted in the camp that was less about logistics and more about the shape of daily life, and it was in that shift that certain things became visible that the speed of the first month had not allowed room for. Ron noticed it first, because noticing the human texture of situations was what he did. The network was not a pack. He had known that intellectually since the beginning. He knew it now in a different way, in the way you know something when you see it operating in actual practice across actual days. A pack has ranks and a pack has territory and a pack has a single leader whose word is the shape of reality. None of those things existed in the meadow. What existed instead was a web of relationships and competencies and trust, and it operated more slowly than a pack's decision-making and produced more friction and required more conversation, and it was dramatically more stable under pressure than anything Ron had ever seen a pack structure produce. He told Sebo this one evening. He said, "This is more resilient than a pack." Sebo said, "Yes." Ron said, "Because nobody can take it from one point. There is no throat to cut. If any one person stops, the rest continues." Sebo said, "Yes." Ron said, "You designed it that way on purpose." Sebo said, "I designed it that way because I knew I might get pulled out at any point, and I needed it to survive that." Ron looked at him for a moment. He said, Who did you think was going to pull you out? Sebo said, I had a list. He said it without irony and without self-pity, the flat delivery of someone reporting a fact. Ron sat with the specific weight of that, with the understanding of what it means to build something assuming you will be removed, because the world has given you no reason to assume otherwise. He said, you are not going to be pulled out now. Sebo said, I know. He paused. He said, that is a new thing. The coalition's administrator for the Asheville division sent a formal communication to the network's publicly known location on the 4th week of the second month. The communication acknowledged the network's existence, declined to name it by any specific designation, and offered a process for any displaced wolves to reintegrate into the coalition's regional structure under a standard intake framework. The language was generous. The terms were not. Sebo drafted the response in 1 hour. He had Claire read it, and Evan read it, and Kieran read it, and all three of them came back with minor suggestions that he incorporated. The response declined the reintegration offer. It noted, specifically and with citation, 7 documented instances of the coalition's absorption methods producing adverse outcomes for the absorbed populations. It invited any regional authority with questions about the evidence to contact the network through the relay system. He signed it with his full name. Claire asked him why he signed it with his full name. He said, because the coalition told 23 packs in this region that I was a contaminated Omega who fabricated evidence. I want them to know that the contaminated Omega is still here and still working and has a name. She looked at him for a moment. She said, that is the first time I have heard you explain a choice in terms of yourself. He said, it is the first time it has been relevant. Kieran and Dex worked with Evan and a Crestline representative named Nora to establish a formal communication structure between the network and Crestline, and through Crestline to the 3 smaller groups that Crestline maintained relationships with. It was not an alliance. Nobody called it that. It was a framework for information sharing and mutual acknowledgement. The document that established it was 2 pages long and had no ceremonial language in it anywhere. It was, Nora said, the least dramatic formal agreement she had ever signed, and she meant it as a compliment. On the 38th day of the second month, a coalition patrol crossed the eastern boundary of what had been Asheville territory and continued past it into unclaimed land that had previously been considered part of the Outer Reaches buffer zone. This was either a mistake or a deliberate test. Sebo thought it was a test. Claire thought it was both. The patrol was documented. The crossing was reported to Crestline through the communication framework. Crestline forwarded the report to Hollow Ridge. Hollow Ridge sent a formal objection through regional channels. The 3 smaller groups connected to Crestline signed onto the objection. The combined weight of 6 regional groups objecting to a single patrol crossing created a record that the coalition's regional authority was obligated to address, by their own published governance standards, within 10 business days. They addressed it in 4. The patrol had made a navigation error. The coalition regretted any concern. The boundary would be observed. It was the smallest possible victory and it was enormous. Not because it stopped the coalition. It had not stopped the coalition. The coalition was still large and well organized and had absorbed the Asheville Pack and was still operating in the region and would continue to operate in the region. But 6 groups had moved together through a structure that Sebo had built from the outside of a pack that threw him away, and the coalition had responded, and the response was on the record, and the record was the architecture of what came next. Voss, who had been in the camp for 2 weeks at that point, had the news from Perry, who told it to him without editorializing. Voss sat with it for a long moment. He said, he planned all of this from the beginning. Perry said, he built a framework that made it possible. That is different. Voss said, what is the difference? Perry said, planning is when you know the outcome. Building a framework is when you trust the people inside it to find the outcomes you cannot predict yet. Voss was quiet for a while. Then he said, I thought I knew how things worked. Perry said, you knew how one kind of thing worked. He stood up and went back to what he had been doing, and Voss sat alone with the specific solitude of a person who has been left not with punishment but with accuracy. Sebo stood at the ridge at dusk on the evening of the 6th week mark and looked out at the landscape below the outer ridge. The territory that had been Asheville. The wider region beyond it. The shapes of things from up here had a clarity they did not have at ground level. The coalition was large. The network was small. The situation was not resolved and would not be resolved in any short timeline. Karen came up beside him. They stood together. Karen said, "Are you satisfied with where this is?" Sebo said, "I am satisfied with what this is. Whether it is where I want it to be is a different question." Karen said, "What do you want it to be?" Sebo said, "Enough. I want it to be enough." He did not say what he meant by enough, and Karen did not ask because some things are understood in the space between words and do not improve by being said out loud. The meadow below them held the network. The fires were lit. The sounds of an evening camp came up the slope, low voices, the movement of the supply walk, someone laughing at something Perry had said, because Perry's quietly funny quality had become one of the camp's consistent small goods. Ron came up the slope and stood on Sebo's other side. The three of them stood on the ridge in the cooling evening air and looked at what they were part of. Dex came up last, standing at the end of the row, and the four of them were there together in the way they had been together since the river crossing, which was the way of people who have made the same choice and know it and do not need to keep naming it. Owen appeared at the bottom of the slope and called up that the evening meal was ready. Ron said, "Come in." He looked at Sebo before he turned. He said, "What do we call this place?" Sebo looked at the meadow. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Petra asked me that." He said, "I told her structures take longer than victories." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Maybe we call it that. The structure. Until something better presents itself." Ron said, "The structure." Sebo said, "Or just here." Here is also accurate. Karen turned and started down the slope. Dex followed. Ron looked at Sebo one more second, in the way of a person who wants to say something and decides the moment is already complete without it, and then he turned and went down the slope. Sebo stood on the ridge for another minute. The sky was doing something complicated with the last of the light, producing colors that did not have clean names, sitting somewhere between gold and gray in the way things do when the day is not quite done with itself. He looked at the meadow. He looked at the fires. He looked at the people moving between them, wolves from broken places who had built something here that did not have a clean name either, something that was not a park and was not an organization and was not a victory and was not a home, except that it was all of those things in the way that things are when they are built by people who have nothing left to lose and everything left to become. He went down the slope. The meadow received him the way it received everyone who came to it. Without ceremony. Without rank. Without the need to ask where you had been or what had been done to you or what you had failed to do. The fire was warm. The meal was ready. Petra handed him a cup without being asked, because she had learned his habits, and he said thank you, which was not something he had said much in the 11 years before, because nobody had given him things that required thanks. He sat down. The network moved around him. Karen was at the map table. Ron was beside Perry making something funny happen without meaning to. Dex was talking to Evan's representative about the next phase of the communication framework. Ida was teaching Owen something about supply organization and Owen was pretending to already know it, which was also something Ida knew, and she was being generous about it. Voss sat at the far edge of the fire, outside the natural orbit of the group, but inside the firelight. He ate what he had been given. He did not speak. He was learning, slowly, what it felt like to be received without rank. It was, he was discovering, more complicated than it looked from the other side. Claire came and sat beside Sebo and said, "The relay brought a message from a group northeast of Crestline. They want to know about the information framework." Sebo said, "Good." He said, "What else?" She told him. He listened. He updated the thing he was always updating in his head, the map that was not a map of territory but a map of what was possible, and where the paths ran, and how far they could go before they became something else. The fire burned. The camp breathed. The outer reach held them in its cold and indifferent way, which had come to feel, over the weeks, like a different kind of holding, like the kind that does not require you to perform yourself in exchange for the warmth. Nobody said what they were building would last. Nobody promised anything about what came next. The coalition was still out there and still moving, and the work was still early, and there were 100 ways the structure could be tested and a number of those ways it might not survive. But the structure was here. Tonight it was here. And here, as Sebo had said on the ridge, was accurate. It was enough to start with. It was enough to continue,